Well, would you look at that? I don't know how we pulled this off, but we made it past 7,000 subscribers regardless. Just over a week before this video was made, I put up a community post asking for questions for an eventual Q&A thingy, and this is the video in which I answer said questions. And if you're wondering why you're watching a Class 35 HiMech right now, that's because D7081 has the same number as the subscriber count I had on the morning of Monday, September 11. I believe this is an ex-Iron Horse House model re-released by Dovetail Games, as part of a bigger pack that included two other IHH rehashes, namely the Class 42 Warship and the Class 52 Western. And when the bloody hell is Armstrong Powerhouse ever going to make a sound pack for the Class 35? I will be using a variety of background footage from real life, Train Simulator, Trains 2019, or the soon-to-be obsolete Train Sim World 3, as and when I see fit. What's your least favourite TSW route? Mine is NEC New York. Well, I can't say I blame you there. I mean, that was a pretty stupid choice, only to do, what was it, Newark Airport to New Rochelle? But my personal least favourite route in this game is either New York to Trenton or the Long Island Railroad. The reasons why I hate those routes are A. Their terrible scenery, and B. Unrealistically Spartan timetables. Not to mention the terrible build quality of the Trenton route as a whole, as well as the inclusion of absolutely sod-all NJT or LIRR motive power. We've only got the NJT ALP46 with multi-level coaches, as well as the LIRR M3 and M7 electric multiple units. Apart from the lack of proper coaches for the Silver Star and Silver Meteor services, the Amtrak side of the rail scene isn't too bad, because we at least have both the ACS 64 and Estella, plus the Amfleet coaches and Metroliner cab car to represent Northeast Regional and Keystone services. If there's any US state that you want to visit, where would you go? My money's on New York State, simply because of the incredibly busy commuter rail scene around New York City itself. A close second would probably be California or Alaska. Do you have a Trains with a Z game? If so, what is your favourite route? Yes, I've got Trains 2019. But I only use it when I'm making my own Thomas the Tank Engine stories. I mean, I say my own, but some of them are adaptations from previous stories. My favourite route is probably the Island of Sodor one from Sodor Island 3D. It's quite versatile because of the large number of locations, such as Knapford Station, the Farquhar and Brendam branches, Gordon's Hill, and other iconic locations all present on the same route. Do you like coffee and donuts? I like neither, because I don't drink coffee, and I'm not a stereotypical police officer. BNSF, MRCE, EWS, KiwiRail, OBB, J&R, and CSX. What are your top 3 favourites? Well, I barely know anything about MRCE, Österreichische Bundesbahnen, or J&R, assuming that's a Japanese company. So my picks would probably be KiwiRail, EWS, and CSX. And speaking of EWS, I recently picked up a second-hand Hornby Class 56 in EWS colours from Clark Railworks. It was quite a steal too, only costing around 130 New Zealand dollars. And this specific model was very heavily weathered as well. Do you like the MBTA? If you do, what and why? I'm indifferent on the MBTA, because I don't know too much about the network as a whole, especially where the subway lines are concerned. Although I will say that I find that Ashmont to Mattapan line to be quite bizarre, purely because of its use of the vintage PCCs. As for the commuter rail side, those rebuilt F40PH locomotives are quite interesting, as are the stations that have a short section of high-level platform for wheelchair access, although that's actually where the F40PH-3C stops in TSW. I also think that it's rather dumb that they don't use electric locomotives on the Boston South to Providence service, or any electric locomotive at all, for that matter. If you could design routes for a proposed New Zealand inter-regional rail network, which ones would you bring back? So strange that New Zealand had that in the past, and not so much anymore. Oh boy, where do I even start? For one thing, it's absolutely disgraceful that this country now has sod-all passenger services outside of Auckland and Wellington. I mean, don't get me wrong, cars, trucks and buses can still have their uses and benefits, but for long-distance travel, they are hopelessly inefficient when compared to trains, especially those bloody trucks. Diesel locomotives don't have anywhere near as bad of a pollution problem as road vehicles, so even if KiwiRail didn't electrify the lines, a passenger train would still be better for the environment than excessive numbers of road vehicles like there are now. As for what rail services I would bring back, here are 4 examples. Number 1. Christchurch to Invercargill, otherwise known as the Southerner. This service launched in 1971 to replace the steam-hauled South Island Limited, and it remained in operation until 2002. A reactivated service on this line could start out from Christchurch's Addington Station, also used by the Transalpine to Greymouth and Coastal Pacific to Picton. Then the train would stop in Rolleston, Ashburton, Timaru, Oamaru and Dunedin on the way. All those towns have still got railway stations in place, so they would just need to be restored to a good condition. 2. Auckland to Rotorua, otherwise known as the Geyserland Express. The original service was operated with the Silverfern rail cars and ran from 1991 to 2001. It's insane that the branch from Putaruru to Rotorua was closed, because Rotorua was, and still is, a major tourist attraction. If the line was ever reinstated, there's the obvious potential to get rid of those stupid rail cruisers and run a tourist train, or better yet, a passenger train that's actually reasonably priced for the locals instead of just the rich tourists, from Auckland to Rotorua again. 3. Auckland to Tauranga, or the Kaimai Express. Like the Rotorua service, this one was operated with Silverfern rail cars and ran from 1991 to 2001. It's infuriating that Tauranga has been forced to go without a regional passenger service for 22 years now! And given how fast this region is growing, there's enough people here to warrant that alternative option for a means of getting to and from Hamilton or Auckland. If these higher-ups ever take the hint and actually set up a new passenger service, I want it to start out from a station in Mount Maunganui, specifically at the northern end of Totara Street, in front of the old fire station. Then go up to Auckland Strand while stopping at the Bayfair Shopping Centre, downtown Tauranga, Omokoroa, Morrinsville, Frankton, Rotokauri, Huntly, Pokeno, Papakura, Puhinui, and Newmarket on the way. Of course, new stations would have to be built in Mount Maunganui, Bayfair, Tauranga, Omokoroa, Morrinsville, and Pokeno, but they would have a huge benefit to people living in the area, as they wouldn't need to rely so heavily on those blasted cars. 4. Hamilton to Taupo, the latter being a small town on the northern shore of Lake Taupo, and it's very popular with tourists, for some reason. This would require an extension of the Kinleith branch, but the end result would essentially just be an alternative to driving on the busy State Highway 1, not to mention a more relaxed alternative to the overused car or bus. This service could start out from Frankton Station, then stop in Ruakura for the nearby university, as well as Morrinsville, Matamata, Tiro, Putaruru, and Tokoroa before eventually reaching Taupo. Why don't you like SimRail? Simple. A lack of knowledge or interest in Polish railways. Do you think that TSW4 could maybe still be any good in the future, if they won't make TSW5? I really don't know. In all honesty, I don't have high hopes for TSW4, especially given Dovetail's long-lasting reputation for ripping people off with often low-quality products, not to mention their insistence on releasing more content instead of fixing existing bugs. That is not the ideal way to retain player interest. Don't even get me started on the Talent 1's awful reused sounds, and the convenient lack of the MP36PH-3C locomotives and Bombardier bi-level coaches on the Antelope Valley line, when I thought a simple reskin of those existing Caltrain models wasn't too much to ask. Would you work for DTG if you could change their business practices? No, I wouldn't. As for those hacks ever changing their business practices, I dare say that one can only dream, because it seems like, at this point, trying to get Dovetail to improve is as hard as figuring out how to drive the New Zealand Railways KB steam locomotive in TS Classic. What are your thoughts on the fact that Rivet Games are making another Swiss route for TSW? I have no hope that it will be anywhere near good. Call me a pessimist if you want, but Rivet Games made an absolute dog's breakfast of the Arosa line, and I still can't believe that they thought it was a good idea to only make S-Bahn Central Schweiz a pathetic 16 miles long. Granted, that's the same length as the Arosa line, but it is criminally short for a standard gauge commuter line. Anyone would think that Rivet is completely incapable of making even a decent TSW route, let alone one that's actually good. I swear, their quality control is even worse than Dovetail, and that is really saying something. Do you like the Helsinki Metro? I have no opinion on that system. Not helped by the fact that I don't know anything about the railways in Finland. Top 3 steam locomotives? Well, I can safely say that one of them is the New Zealand Railways JA class. Not 100% sure about the other two choices, but I'm leaning in favour of the Great Western Railway 7200 class 282 tank and LBN SCR A1 or A1X Terrier class 060 tank. Your favourite DLCs from the TSW franchise? Island Line 2022, Niedertalbahn, and Nachwerker Dresden. Top 3 Thomas and Friends episodes? My favourite episode of the whole show is Horrid Lorry from Season 5. It's hard to say what the other two are, because the first 5 seasons were all fantastic, and quite frankly that's the only era of the show that I still like. I think I would have to go with Grandpuff and Sleeping Beauty from Season 4, and Lady Hat's Birthday Party from Season 5. Also, yes, I do consider Grandpuff and Sleeping Beauty to be one big episode, even though it's really just a 2-parter. What made you want to start a YouTube channel? I'm struggling to remember the exact reason, but a constant throughout the channel's existence has been uploads of real-life rail fanning footage here in New Zealand. And that's one of the reasons why the channel still exists, alongside my interest in reviewing TSW products. Do you like olives? Can't say I do, because I've always thought they tasted rather strange. Do you like pineapple on pizza? Believe it or not, yes. It's normally the only way in which I ever eat pineapple. What is your favourite route in TSW? Island Line 2022. While it is very short, and there's sod all service variation, I've always been fascinated by the railway history on this island. Then there's the unusual motive power, rebuilt ex-London Underground D78 stock, now designated as Class 484. The round trip from Ryde Pierhead to Shanklin is one of my favourite services to operate in the whole game, partially because it can be completed in less than 60 minutes. Which route in TSW do you hate the most? Either the West Cornwall Local, despite not owning it, or the Long Island Railroad. As I am looking for more US passenger routes, would you recommend Trenton after its update, in a sale? I have yet to experience the updated New York to Trenton route, so I can't say whether or not it's worth picking up for yourself. Have you tried, or considered trying, Derail Valley? No, because I have never had any interest in that game. To me, it just seems like a more arcade-like version of Train Sim World, and that's really saying something. I prefer to drive trains in a realistic manner, not crash them off the bloody line at every single opportunity. What is your top level locomotives of New Zealand? Firstly, it's what are, not what is. Yes, I know I'm a grammar Nazi, now swiftly moving on. If I'm getting the definition of top level right, I'd say either the Clayton-built D-Class 040 of 1929, or the G-Class Garretts of 1928. A cop-out answer would have been KiwiRail's DL Class. Have you been on the Capital Connection, the Northern Explorer, Te Huia, or the one that goes from Masterton to Wellington? Yes, I've ridden on all four of those services, although not the refurbished Capital Connection, although I suppose it's technically re-refurbished since they're actually former SA coaches, and now they've been refurbished twice. Even though the Wairarapa Connection is still the shortest of these four services, in terms of its journey time, I still think it's my favourite of the bunch. I say that because of its interesting stopping pattern, the reasonably comfortable SW and SE coaches, and of course the fact that the DFB locomotives sound quite good when they're notching up. Not to mention the bizarre combination of the long Rimutaka tunnel and the section next to Wellington Harbour on the same line. I just wish that the Masterton to Pahiatua section of the Wairarapa line had regular freight trains again. What are your favourite electric trains in New Zealand? If we're talking multiple units specifically, since locomotives and trains are not the same thing, then my answer is the EM/ET or Gans Marvag electric multiple units that ran Wellington suburban services from 1982 to 2016. What's your favourite NZ locomotive? It can be imported like the DX. For locomotives built domestically, I'd still say the hillside variant of the JA class, of which there were 35, built between 1946 and 1956, alongside the 16 North British examples in 1952. What is your favourite locomotive livery? If we're just talking about New Zealand liveries, then my money is on Transrail Blue, even though that operator wasn't very good. At all. As for foreign liveries, my favourite is perhaps Amtrak Phase 3, as seen on the iconic EMD F40PH, and, to a lesser extent, Siemens ACS 64 number 662. Do you miss the DXs in the North Island? Oh, of course I do, especially the days when 5016, 5080 and 5143 were regular sights in the Bay of Plenty. Of course, that was long before KiwiRail's shocking decision to rebuild 5143 of all locomotives as a DXC. The last time I saw a DX running up north, before she was transferred south, was in July 2019, when DXB 5074 and a DL 9325 were hauling train 225 down to Wellington. These days, DXs only ever come back up north if they need maintenance at Hutt workshops, and only stay for a month or two for the so-called shakedown period, if needed. Will you review any Steam era routes on TS Classic? I've written a script for a review on the Falmouth branch, but I don't know when that video will be made. Another Steam era route I'd like to review eventually is Western Lines of Scotland. Will you review anything from Caledonia Works? I'd certainly like to at some point, possibly looking at the North Eastern Railway Raven A2, but no promises. For anyone who doesn't know, Caledonia Works is a third-party developer that makes very high-quality steam locomotive add-ons in Train Simulator Classic, mainly focusing on more obscure designs like the Caledonian Railway 600 class, Great Northern Railway K1 class, and LNWR 422 No. 3020, Cornwall. The modelling and texturing on Mr. Wilson's locomotives are excellent, and little details like the Bible present on the footplate are just as nice. And although the chuff sounds can be a bit dodgy and out of sync, the engines are still fun to drive. Favourite Southern steam engine? 4501. I assume you're referring to the Southern Railway of England, in which case my favourite is either the bullied Pacifics, as much of a cop-out as that is, or the A1/A1X Terriers, even though those things are a pre-grouping design. I've also got Hornby models of the A1 and Merchant Navy classes, as well as an old Bachmann version of the Lord Nelson 460, even though I haven't got much interest in that class. What is your opinion on Century of Steam? Don't have one, because it hasn't been released yet. But I've seen Heist talk about it a few times, and I predict that it'll turn out to be Railroads Online done right. There are a number of reasons why I've lost interest in Railroads Online. Do you think that DTG or any other third parties will make DLCs like the S-Bahn Berlin, as that has been requested by the German community? I have no idea what goes on at DTG headquarters when they decide what route suggestions are very simple yet unpopular, or ones to toss in the too hard basket and never revisit. But it would be nice to see a Berlin S-Bahn route in TSW, given its unique third rail electrification, and many other reasons. But personally, the one German route that I want to see in TSW is a remake of München to Garmisch-Partenkirchen. Would you say that DTG takes player feedback into account? Don't make me laugh. My answer is no, or hardly ever, if at all, because they still leave bugs unfixed while moving on to another DLC release, and their route choices are nothing short of baffling, or downright stupid in the case of the Antelope Valley line. What routes would you have liked/wanted to see in TSW4? Firstly, the Cascais line in Portugal. This is a commuter route that runs for 25.4 kilometers from Lisbon Cais del Sodré to Cascais along a pretty coastline, and I apologise if I mispronounce those names. The line uses 1668mm gauge, and is quite unique in that it still uses 1500 volt DC electrification. The line is served by Comboios de Portugal 3150 and 3250 class EMUs, whose refurbished yet old-fashioned appearance reminds me of the Comenge EMUs in Melbourne, Australia. Secondly, the Uetlibergbahn in Switzerland. This is yet another bizarre commuter line, running for only 10.3 kilometers from Zurich Hauptbahnhof to Uetliberg. Journey time is only 20 to 25 minutes for the whole line, and it starts on a short underground section before winding its way up a steep mountain, with gradients as steep as 1 in 14. I've posted this suggestion on the Dovetail Live forums, so fingers crossed it will eventually come to TSW. Hopefully not made by Rivet Games. In your opinion, is N3V Games' Trains with a Z series any better than Dovetail Games' TSW? I have very little experience with the Trains with a Z series, especially since I only used Trains 2019 for recording footage to use in Thomas episodes. But I generally think it's more annoying than TSW, especially with its sometimes subpar performance. And credit where it's due, at least TSW hardly ever lags unless there's loads of trains nearby. What is your least favourite locomotive, if any, whether they be steam, diesel or electric? Least favourite steamer is the SNCB Type 12, hands down, solely because of the weird proportions and ugly streamlining. Not sure about least favourite diesels or electrics, since I can't think of anything from those categories that I dislike anywhere near as much as that streamlined Belgian thingy. Which locomotive is unusual that everyone dislikes but you actually like? That's a tough one to answer, if I'm honest. I can't really think of any especially infamous locomotives aside from the NZR's E66. As an aside, I lost all respect for History in the Dark, assuming I had any to begin with, when he showed a clear lack of research the one time he talked about E66. On the other hand, I can give you an example of the opposite, where it's a popular locomotive that I don't like. Said locomotive is the New South Wales Government Railways C38 class number 3801. What are your thoughts on the way the rail network is like in its current state? I am very disappointed with the current state of the network. It almost seems like KiwiRail are losing more and more traffic to the roads. Proceeds to glare at the North Auckland line and New Plymouth Port Shunt in particular. And it doesn't help that there are sod-all passenger trains outside of Auckland and Wellington. I plan on making a full video dedicated to my frustration with the current New Zealand rail network, but absolutely no promises on when that will be made. If there was a New Zealand route that you would like to see in TSW, if it isn't crap, what would it be? Hamilton to Mount Maunganui, complete with the branch lines to Hautapu and Waitoa. That way, we would have better service variation instead of just taking container trains on the main line. Included motive power could be the DL class, as the mainline locomotive, as well as the much older DC and DSG classes. DCs are used on the M52 shunts to Hautapu and Waitoa, while DSGs are shunters, and at least one example of this class is currently running in both Hamilton and Mount Maunganui. An alternative option would be Napier to Gisborne as it was around 23 years ago, long before severe weather destroyed several parts of the line. You could just include the DC or DXB locomotives for freight service, as well as the WA steam locomotive for the excursions out of Gisborne. The strangest part of the line is easily the section where it crosses the runway at Gisborne Airport. With the South Island and its limited excursions, what do you think should be happening? And how should they get steam back around Christchurch to the mountains? I honestly don't have much of an opinion on the topic, because I'm not familiar with how the South Island lines operate. But I have remembered A428 at the Weka Pass Railway. Maybe she could be restored to mainline condition, and to take excursions from Waikari to Arthur's Pass or Christchurch to Picton. I reckon that would work out well, given that the A-Class 462s are an ideal size for mainline running. What's your favourite train from the USA? I assume you mean multiple units, since locomotives are not trains. In which case, I don't really know, since the US doesn't have many DMUs or EMUs outside of the northeast cities. One obscure design that I kind of like is the Sacramento Northern 1003 class, even though these are interurban vehicles that are pretty much just a tram-train hybrid. As for my favourite American locomotive, it's either the EMD SD40-2, Union Pacific 412-2, EMD DD40AX, General Electric U50, Pennsylvania Railroad S1, or maybe the New York Central S-Motor. Yes, I know the SD40-2 is a massive cop-out, now swiftly moving on. I'm mainly remembering the US locomotives I've got in TS Classic, which are often very basic and are just not fun to drive, especially those ones made by Digital Train Model. Do you think that the new PC editor for TSW4 will bring new developers to TSW like TTB and Aerosoft, etc.? Not sure, especially since I'm probably not going to use the editor myself. It just seems way too advanced for my liking. But I look forward to seeing what people can create with it. And if I'm not mistaken, TTB is short for Train Team Berlin. I have no experience with any of their products, but I do remember Maverick Hunter Daniel bringing up their AI-only model of a Berlin S-Bahn train, I think it was the BR481, and saying that it was quite good quality for something that wasn't meant to be driven by the player, especially when compared to Just Trains and their awful AI-only London Underground S-Stock model that came with the Chiltern mainline. Do you think that DCG will stop milking the shit out of players once sales maybe drop? I hope so, because it seems like the only way of getting these greedy hacks, that seemingly only care about money, to change their ways is to vote with our wallets. I say this despite my intention to still buy TSW4, because I want to review, or rather blast, the routes that it comes with, and future DLC for that matter. Would you consider reviewing SimRail once they've announced Dresden to Görlitz, and US routes have been released? For those who don't know, I haven't got SimRail because I have no interest in Polish railways, but I've never heard of this Görlitz place, and I wasn't aware of those developers making US routes. Even then, I honestly don't want to review SimRail, although that's nothing personal against the people who have suggested I do so. What are your opinions on most US railways, and which is your favourite? I think the US has a healthy variety of locomotives, or rather, had, if the onslaught of AC44C6Ms on Norfolk Southern is anything to go by, with some noteworthy locomotives being the EMD F59PHI, General Electric ET44C4 and BQ23-7, EMD DD35A, and the ever-weird Morrison-Knudsen TE70-4S, which were a quartet of rebuilt U-25Bs on Southern Pacific. Because we don't really get this sort of thing in New Zealand, I think it's very bizarre seeing freight trains long enough to have 4 locomotives up front, as well as distributed power units elsewhere in the consist. But I do prefer the passenger services, and I guess my favourite operator would either be Coaster, which runs from San Diego to Oceanside, or the Music City Star, which runs from Nashville to Lebanon. What is your favourite steam locomotive in the TSW era before TSW4? Well, there's only 3 steam locomotives currently in TSW, and even though I don't really care for it in real life too much, I would say that the one I least don't unhate the most is the Fowler 4F. I honestly have little to no interest in the Stanya Jubilee and 8F, despite owning a model of Jubilee class number 5563 Australia in the LMS Crimson Lake livery. Do you think the Great Western Express route should be redone, or in other words, given a refresh? Yes, without a doubt. I don't like the route as it is now, simply because it's very outdated and way too linear. I mean, come on, they could have at least extended the coverage of the main line to Swindon, or at the very least, added the Class 165 as well as the 4 Thames Valley branches. If DTG ever revisits this route, I want it to be updated to a 2022 setting, complete with full electrification out to Reading, as well as the Class 165, 166, 345, 387, 800 and 802 trains. Not to mention the long overdue addition of the branch lines to Greenford, Windsor and Eton Central, Marlow via Bourne End, and Henley-on-Thames. The devs could have added AI-only versions of the London Underground S7 and 1992 stock, as the Central Line trains would be seen at Ealing Broadway and Greenford, while the S stock would be seen on District Line services at Ealing Broadway, as well as the Hammersmith and City Line between Westbourne Park and Paddington. Apart from the Island Line, what 5 UK routes would you recommend to players? East Coast Way, plus the Class 313, Tees Valley Line, plus the Class 31 and Class 20, Midland Main Line, even though it's far too short for the HST, plus Cathcart Circle and the South Eastern High Speed route, along with the Class 700. What's your favourite UK train? I haven't really got one solid favourite on the electric side, but one of them is the Class 487 from the Waterloo and City Line. Another is the Class 506, of which 8 examples were built in the early 1950s for the Manchester to Hadfield and Glossop commuter services, on a route that still survives today, albeit with Class 323s and a 25,000 volts AC electrification instead of the original 1500 volt DC. My favourite UK diesel, on the other hand, may come across as a strange or unexpected choice. It's the Northern Ireland Railways Class 450. I know you don't play SimRail, but do you think they would do a better job than DTG at a realistic train sim? I don't know enough about the game to properly answer that question, but I will say that I hope it'll finally give Dovetail motivation to get their act together, especially if they have any hope in hell of keeping their business alive. And lastly, how do you get inside the cabs of locomotives? I'm guessing you're referring to the picture of DFT 7008's control stand that I attached to the community post. That was taken in Mount Maunganui back in July 2013, and on the rare occasions when I've been allowed in a locomotive's cab, it's always been at the driver's invitation. I don't like to ask unless I'm at a heritage railway. Despite criticising Dovetail Games and Train Sim World content numerous times in your videos, all your criticisms are valid by the way, why do you continue to invest in new Train Sim World add-ons? I had a feeling someone would ask this sort of question at some point. Not saying they shouldn't, mind. There's a few reasons why I still play the game and buy new add-ons. A. I still like being able to walk around the world and ride as a passenger, instead of just being stuck in a driver's cab. B. The presence of timetable mode means that, if all you want to do is just get in quickly and drive a train, you don't have to go through the tedious process of finding scenarios online, sorting out all the DLC requirements, or making scenarios yourself like you have to do in TS Classic. And C. There are still people out there who want to hear my thoughts on this stuff. Have you thought about checking out SimRail's multiplayer mode? No, because I forgot that it existed, plus my other reasons for not wanting to play that game. What are your favourite and least favourite seasons of Thomas & Friends, not counting All Engines Go? Thankfully, because that reboot is fucking abysmal. My favourite season of The Real Show, as in seasons 1 to 24, is easily season 5, while my least favourite is season 12. Hands up all those who thought it was going to be one from the Sharon Miller era. I never liked the weird combination of CGI people and CGI faces over top of the real models, with the old static faces and figurines still used in distant shots, a style that was exclusive to season 12. And then there was the painfully dumb writing and very formulaic stories, as seen in episodes like Thomas and the Billboard, Tram Trouble, Heave Ho Thomas, Saved You, and Henry Gets It Wrong. The absolute worst episode of that season is Push Me Pull You. Who thought it was a good idea to have Skarloey and Rheneas acting like little children? I mean, yes, they are small locomotives, but they are not kids. And Skarloey, at least in the Railway series, was written as a wise old sage, not a stupid wimp who was afraid of the rain while trying to rescue some sheep, if I'm remembering the events of Skarloey Storms Through properly. Have you been in the cab of a DL? Yes, and on more than one occasion to boot. The first time was with the class leader, DL 9008, in November 2010, on the day she arrives off the ship from China. The most recent time was at National Park in September 2020, with the locomotive involved being DL 9193. What routes would you like to see a train service run between in New Zealand? I'm guessing you just mean a passenger service, in which case my answers are the ones I mentioned earlier, as well as Auckland to Helensville, or better yet, all the way to Whangarei, and Palmerston North to Gisborne, or at the very least, just Palmerston North to Napier. If you were the CEO of KiwiRail, what would you do? I don't even want to think about the idea of being KiwiRail's CEO, because I'm not the sort of person who wants to work in higher management of any company. How long do you think the DLs will last? Apparently at least 2 DLs, and of course they just have to be 9008 and 9014, are already stored at Hutt workshops now that the newcomers are in service. Anyone would think that these cheap locomotives weren't even designed to last a particularly long time. I wonder what sort of locomotive KiwiRail will bring in when it's time to replace the DLs. Maybe it'll be a repeat of what Transrail did in the 1990s, by bringing all those ex-Queensland Rail locomotives over here, only to end up barely using any of them. Have you driven a train before? No, but I have driven 3 locomotives in real life, namely DXR 8022, DFT 7077 and a JA 1271. The 2 diesels were on separate occasions in Mount Maunganui around 12 years ago, back when 7077 was still A, painted in Transrail black, and B, designated as a DFT, while I got to drive JA 1271 at Steam Incorporated's Open Weekend in January 2023. And of course, in all 3 cases, it was under supervision from an experienced driver. Back in April 2010, DXR 8022 was still in the patched toll rail livery, but she has since been repainted in KiwiRail colours to match her sister, DXR 8007. Which steam locomotive would you like to see from the 3 main countries in TSW? From Germany, preferably those narrow gauge 210-2 tank engines, specifically on 750mm gauge, then the Denver and Rio Grande Western K37 class from the USA, and the Great Western Railway 7200 class from the UK. What is the worst locomotive, in your opinion? The SNCB Type 12, for the same reasons I mentioned earlier. As for the worst diesel or worst electric, my picks are British Railways number 10100, otherwise known as the FEL, and the Lyon Metro MPL 85, although that's just going off their external appearance. What locomotive would you save from extinction? If you mean resurrecting an extinct class in the form of a new build, just like Peppercorn A1 number 60163 Tornado, then I'd have to say the New Zealand Railways Q class. These were 462 Pacifics built by Baldwin in 1901, and it's absolutely criminal that none were preserved, especially given that they were the world's first true Pacifics. If you could visit any UK station, what would it be? Ryder Pierhead, because of its bizarre status as being right at the end of a ruddy pier. The Isle of Wight has long been one of my favourite routes in TS Classic, and now TSW, so that's the one part of England I want to visit in real life. Do you think the TSW franchise will die eventually? Yes, if Dovetail continues to rip off their players with half-baked add-ons while still not fixing existing bugs. But, as someone who still enjoys playing the game, I don't want it to die. Which is that one TSW route you felt like had so much potential but ended up being a big disappointment? Long Island Railroad or CN Oakville Subdivision, hands down. See my reviews of those routes for why I think they're so disappointing. What's your favourite Thomas character? Either Toby the Tram Engine or the Cully Fell Railways No. 4. What's your favourite game? Either Train Simulator Classic or Train Sim World, in spite of Dovetail Games' frustrating business practices. Do you think the reason why DTG didn't include multiplayer in TSW is that they have a reason to bring TSW 5? I have no idea, and I bloody well hope that TSW 5 doesn't become a real thing. And at this point, I want Dovetail to stay far away from the idea of introducing multiplayer to this game, given how buggy it still is. But that begs the question as to why Matt Peddleston himself explicitly stated that there would be multiplayer in TSW back in late 2016. If anyone remembers that cringeworthy preview video where Dovetail first announced that CSX heavy haul thingy. And here's the last of all the questions. What do you believe is the best steam locomotive DLC in the Train Sim World games? There's only 2 in the game so far. I have no opinion on the Flying Scotsman in TSW4 because that hasn't been released yet. Neither barely captures the Spirit of Steam or Peak Forester good, in my opinion. They both suffer from the same problems of A. Dovetail's insistence on only replicating the British Railways era, B. Unrealistically Spartan timetables that make the routes feel like desolate ghost towns, C. Underwhelming and reused locomotives, and D. Very questionable route choices, especially in the case of Crewe to Liverpool. And I think that's just about all of the questions that people left for me. I would like to thank everyone who is still watching this channel after all this time, and the same goes for new viewers and subscribers. For now, I will leave you with a few more scenes of this Australian diesel locomotive hauling British rail coaches around a route that depicts one of the locations from the Thomas episode Haunted Henry.